Princely Government by St. Thomas Aquinas. To the King of Cyprus. Chapter 1. The necessity for a political regime. Our first task must be to explain how the term king is to be understood. Now, whenever a certain end has been decided upon, but the means for arriving thereat are still open to choice, someone must provide direction if that end is to be expeditiously attained. A ship, for instance, will sail first on one course and then on another, according to the winds it encounters, and it would never reach its destination but for the skill of a helmsman who steers it to port. In the same way, man, who acts by intelligence, has a destiny to which all his life and activities are directed, for it is clearly the nature of intelligent beings to act with some end in view. Yet the diversity of human interests and pursuits makes it equally clear that there are many courses open to men when seeking the end they desire. Man, then, needs guidance for attaining his ends. Now, every man is endowed with reason, and it is by the light of reason that his actions are directed to their end. So if it befitted man to live a solitary life, after the fashion of many other animals, he would need no other guide, but each would be a king unto himself, under God, the King of kings, and would have the full ordering of his own actions by the light of God-given reason. When we consider all that is necessary to human life, however, it becomes clear that man is naturally a social and political animal, destined more than all other animals to live in a community. Other animals have their food provided for them by nature, and a natural coat of hair. They are also given the means of defence, be it teeth, horns, claws, or at least speed in flight. Man, on the other hand, is not so provided, but having instead the power to reason must fashion such things for himself. Even so, one man alone would not be able to furnish himself with all that is necessary, for no one man's resources are adequate to the fullness of human life. For this reason, the companionship of his fellows is naturally necessary to man. Furthermore, other animals have a natural instinct for what is useful or hurtful to them. The sheep, for instance, instinctively senses an enemy in the wolf. Some animals even appear to have an instinctive knowledge of the medicinal properties of certain herbs and of other things necessary to their existence. Man, on the other hand, has a natural knowledge of life's necessities only in a general way. Being gifted with reason, he must use it to pass from such universal principles to the knowledge of what in particular concerns his well-being. Reasoning thus, however, no one man could attain all necessary knowledge. Instead, nature has destined him to live in society, so that dividing the labour with his fellows, each may devote himself to some branch of the sciences, one following medicine, another some other science, and so forth. This is further evident from the fact that men alone have the power of speech, which enables them to convey the full content of their thoughts to one another. Other animals show their feelings, it is true, but only in a general way, such as when a dog betrays its anger by barking, and other animals in different ways. Man, then, is more able to communicate with his kind than any other animal, even those which appear to be the most gregarious, such as cranes, ants, or bees. Solomon had this in mind when he said in Ecclesiastes, "It is better for two to live together than solitary, for they gain by mutual companionship." The fellow of society being thus natural and necessary to man, it follows with equal necessity that there must be some principle of government within the society. For if a great number of people were to live, each intent only upon his own interests, such a community would surely disintegrate unless there were one of its number to have a care for the common good. Just as the body of a man or of any other animal would disintegrate were there not in the body itself a single controlling force, sustaining the general vitality is of all its other members. As Solomon tells us in Proverbs, "Where there is no ruler, the people shall be scattered." This conclusion is quite reasonable, for the particular interest and the common good are not identical. We differ in our particular interests, and it is the common good that unites the community. But matters which differ thus are the products of different causes. So, in addition to the motives of interest proper to each individual, there must be some principle productive of the good of the many. For this reason, whenever there is an ordered unity arising out of a diversity of elements, there is to be found some such controlling influence. In the material universe, for example, there is a certain order of divine providence, under which all bodies are controlled by the first or heavenly body. Similarly, all material bodies are controlled by rational creatures. In each man, it is the soul which controls the body. And within the soul itself, reason controls the faculties of passion and desire. Lastly, among the members of the body itself is the one principle, moving all the others. Some say it is the heart, but others the head. So in all multiplicity there must be some controlling principle. When matters are thus ordered to some end, it can sometimes happen that such direction takes place, either aright or wrongly. So political rule is sometimes just and sometimes unjust. Now anything is directed aright when it is brought to an end which befits it, but wrongly when it is brought to an end which is not so fitting. The object of a community of free men differs, for instance, from that of a community of slaves. For a free man is one who is master of his own actions, but a slave owes all that he is to another. If, then, a community of free men is administered by the ruler for the common good, such government will be just and fitting to free men. If, on the other hand, the community is directed in the particular interest of the ruler, and not for the common good, this is a perversion of government, and no longer just. Such rulers were warned by God, speaking through Ezekiel, when he said, "Woe to those shepherds who fatten themselves, because they seek only their own comfort." Is it not the duty of the shepherd to pasture his sheep? Shepherds must care for the good of their flock, and all who are in authority for the good of those entrusted to them. When government is unjustly exercised by one man who seeks personal profit from his position instead of the good of the community subject to him, such a ruler is called a tyrant. This word is derived from the idea of force, since a tyrant forcibly oppresses the people instead of ruling justly. The ancients were in the habit of calling all powerful chieftains tyrants. If, on the other hand, unjust government is exercised, not by one man alone, but by several banded together in a clique, such a state of affairs is called an oligarchy, or rule by the few. This can happen when a few rich men take advantage of their wealth to oppress the rest of the people, and such government differs from tyranny only in the fact that the oppressors are many. Finally, unjust government can be exercised by a great number, and it is then called a democracy. Such is mob rule when the common folk take advantage of their numbers to oppress the rich. In such a case, the entire community becomes a sort of tyrant. Similarly, we must distinguish the various types of just rule. If the administration is carried out by some large section of the community, it is commonly called a polity, as for instance when an army rules in the province or a city. If, however, the administration falls to a few, but virtuous men, it is called an aristocracy. That is the rule by the best, and on account of this they are called aristocrats. Finally, if just government is exercised by one man alone, such a person is rightly called a king. So the Lord, speaking through Ezekiel, said, "My servant David shall be king over all. He shall be the sole shepherd of them all." So it is quite clear that it is of the nature of kingship that there should be one to rule, and that he should do so with a view to the common good without seeking private gain. We have already seen that a communal life is proper to man because he would not be able to provide all that is necessary to life out of his own resources if he were to live like a hermit. So it follows that a communal society is the more perfect to the extent that it is sufficient in providing for life's necessities. There is indeed a certain sufficiency in the family of one household, so far as the elementary necessities of nutrition and procreation and such like are concerned. Similarly, in one locality you will find all that is necessary for a particular trade or calling, potentially. In a city, however, there is a perfect community, providing all that is necessary for the fullness of life. And in a province we have an even better example, because in this case there is added the mutual assistance of allies against hostile attack. Whoever, then, rules a perfect community, be it a city or a province, is rightly called king. The head of a household, on the other hand, is not called king but father. Even so, there is a certain similarity about the two cases, and kings are sometimes called the fathers of their people. From what we have said, then, it is clear that a king is one who rules the people of a city or a province for their common good. So Solomon declared in Ecclesiastes, "The king commands over all the lands which are subject to him." Chapter 2. Monarchy, the best form of government. Having introduced our question, it is now our further task to inquire whether it is better for a realm or a city to be ruled by one person or by many. And this question is better approached by considering the object of government. The aim of any ruler should be to secure the well-being of the realm whose government he undertakes, just as it is the task of the helmsman to steer the ship through perilous seas to a safe harbourage. But the welfare and prosperity of a community lies in the preservation of its unity, or, more simply, in peace. For without peace, a communal life loses all advantage, and, because of discord, becomes instead a burden. So the most important task for the ruler of any community is to establish a peaceful unity. Nor has he the right to question whether or no he will so promote the peace of this community, any more than a doctor has the right to question whether he will cure the sick or not. For no one ought to deliberate about the ends for which he must act, but only about the means of those ends. The means to those ends, even. Thus the Apostle, when stressing the unity of the faithful, adds in Ephesians, "Be ye solicitous, for the unity of the Spirit is the bond of peace." So, therefore, government is the more useful to the extent that it is more effectually attains peaceful unity. For that is more fruitful which better attains its object. Now it is clear that that which is itself a unity can more easily produce unity than that which is a plurality, just as that which is itself hot is best adapted to heating things. So government by one person is more likely to be successful than government by many. Furthermore, it is clear that many persons will never succeed in producing unity in the community if they differ among themselves. So a plurality of individuals will already require some bond of unity before they can even begin to rule in any way whatsoever. Just as the whole crew of a ship would never succeed in sailing it on any course unless they were in agreement among themselves. But many may be said to be united in so far as they approach a unity. So it is better for one to rule rather than many, who must first reach agreement. Again, that is best which most nearly approaches a natural process, since nature always works in the best way. But in nature, government is always by one. Among members of the body, there is one which moves all the rest, namely the heart. In the soul there is one faculty which is preeminent, namely reason. The bees have one king, and in the whole universe there is one God, creator and lord of all. And this is quite according to reason, for all plurality derives from unity. So, since the product of art is but an imitation of the work of nature, and since a work of art is the better for being a faithful representation of its natural pattern, it follows of necessity that the best form of government in human society is that which is exercised by one person. This conclusion is also borne out by experience. For cities or provinces which are not ruled by one person are torn by dissensions, and strive without peace. So that the Lord's words seem to be fulfilled when he said, "Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyards." Jeremiah 12. On the other hand, cities and provinces which are governed by one king enjoy peace, flourish in justice, and are made glad by an abundance of riches. So the Lord promised his people by the prophets that, as a great favour, he would place them under one head, and that there would be one prince over them all. Chapter 3. Tyranny, the corruption of monarchy, is the worst form of government. As government by a king is the best, so also government by a tyrant is the worst form of rule. A polity is to be contrasted with a democracy, each, as we have already shown, being a form of government by the multitude. Similarly, an aristocracy contrasts with an oligarchy, each being a form of government by the few. Lastly, tyranny is contrasted with government by a king, each being exercised by one person alone. We have already shown that monarchy is the best form of government, so, as the best is to be contrasted with the worst, it follows that tyranny is the worst form of government. Furthermore, a power which is united is more efficient than one which is divided. Many united in one body can pull what divided, and by single endeavour they could not move. So, just as it is better for a power which is productive of good to be more united, it is more harmful for a power which is productive of evil to be united rather than divided. Now, the power of an unjust ruler is exercised to the detriment of the community, because it substitutes his private interest for the common welfare of the citizens. So, just government is the more beneficial insofar as it proceeds from greater unity. And monarchy is better than aristocracy, which, in turn, is better than a polity. In unjust government, the reverse is the case, since it will be the more damaging to the extent that it proceeds from greater unity. So tyranny is more harmful than an oligarchy, and an oligarchy is more damaging than a democracy. Again, that which makes government unjust is the fact that the personal aims of the ruler are sought to the detriment of the common welfare. So the greater the damage to the common well-being, the greater will be the injustice of the government. Now there is a greater disregard of the common welfare in an oligarchy, where the private gain of a few citizens is considered, than in a democracy, in which the ends of many are served. Even greater is the harm to the common welfare in the case of a tyranny, where the satisfaction of one man alone is considered. For a great number comes nearer to generality than a few, while a few is nearer than one. Tyranny, then, is the most unjust form of government. The same conclusions are apparent from a study of the order of divine providence, which disposes of all things in the most admirable manner. For goodness arises in things out of one perfect cause, everything being so arranged as to assist the production of goodness. But evil arises out of singularity and individual defect. There is no beauty in a body unless all its members are harmoniously disposed one to another. But there is ugliness as soon as one member is ill-fitting. So ugliness may occur in many ways, and for a diversity of reasons. But of beauty there is only one and perfect cause. This happens in every case where good and bad are contrasted, as though it were the providence of God that's good, proceeding from a single cause, should be the stronger, while evil, proceeding from a diversity of reasons, should be the weaker. It is best, therefore, that just government should be exercised by one man alone, and should be thereby the stronger. But if such government should fall into injustice, it is better that it be exercised by many, and so be weakened by internal friction. So, of all forms of unjust government, democracy is the most tolerable, and tyranny the worst. The same conclusion will also be reached if one considers the evils which are consequent upon tyranny. For the tyrant, being heedless of the common welfare, seeks his personal satisfaction. In consequence, he oppresses his subjects in various ways, according to the nature of the passions by which he is swayed in the pursuit of self-indulgence. If he is a slave to avarice, he steals from his subjects. So Solomon says in Proverbs, "A just king makes rich the earth, but the miser destroys it." If, on the other hand, he is prone to anger, he will shed blood heedlessly. So it is said by Ezekiel, "The princes in their midst are like wolves ravening their prey, to the shedding of blood." And the wise man advises us to avoid such government, saying in Ecclesiastes, "Keep at a distance from him who has power to slay thee." Under such a government death comes, not in satisfaction of justice, but violently and because of unbridled passion. In such circumstances there is no security, and all is uncertain, for there is no law, and no reliance can be placed upon that which depends upon the will, or rather the caprice of another. Such oppression does not bear only upon the material welfare of the subjects, their spiritual welfare is also threatened. For those whose object is power, rather than the service of the community, put obstacles in the way of any progress by their subjects, being suspicious that such progress might threaten their wicked rule. Tyrants always suspect the good rather than the wicked, and are ever afraid of virtue. They seek always to hinder their subjects from becoming virtuous, and from growing in magnanimity of soul, lest they become restless under unjust government. They prevent them from establishing ties of friendship and from enjoying the benefit of fraternal peace, so that being always suspicious one of the other, they can never combine against the tyrant's power. So tyrants sow discord between their subjects, and encourage strife whenever it exists, while at the same time they prohibit all that makes for harmony among men, such as wedding feasts and banquets, and all such activities which normally produce familiarity and confidence among men. They also take steps to prevent anyone from becoming powerful or rich, for they judge their subjects by their own evil consciences, and themselves using power and riches to evil purpose, they go in fear lest the power or wealth of their subjects be harmful to them. So Job, speaking of a tyrant, said, "The sound of terror is ever in his ears, and even when there is peace, that is, when no evil is intended towards him, he is ever suspicious of plots." For this reason, when rulers who should encourage their subjects in the pursuit of virtue look instead with envy and malice upon all virtue, and obstruct it by all means in their power, there will be found few men of virtue living under a tyrannical government. As the philosopher says, strong men will be found among those who hold strength in honour. And Cicero says, whatever is universally despised decays and ceases to flourish. It is natural, then, that men who are nurtured in an environment of fear should be weak and degenerate in spirit and afraid of facing a difficult or strenuous task. This is also provided by the experience of those countries which have remained long under tyranny. So the Apostle says in Colossians, Fathers, provoke not your children to indignation, lest they be discouraged. It was the consideration of these evil consequences of tyranny which led Solomon to say in Proverbs, when the wicked reign, men are ruined, because by reason of the malice of tyrants, men are led away from the perfection of virtue. And again he says, in Proverbs, when the wicked shall bear rule, the people shall mourn. And again, in Proverbs, when the wicked rise up, men shall hide themselves, to avoid the cruelty of tyrants. Nor is this to be wondered at, for a man who exercises authority, not according to reason, but according to the desires of passion, in no way differs from a beast. So Solomon says, again in passions, in Proverbs even, as a roaring lion and a hungry bear, so is a wicked prince over the poor people. So men flee from tyrants as they would from a cruel beast. Nor is it any different to be subject to a tyrant or to a savage beast. Chapter 4. The types of government among the Romans, and the advantages sometimes present in government by many. Because both the best and the worst is to be found in monarchy, or government by one man, many people, knowing the evils of tyranny, regard the very name of king with hate. For it sometimes happens that those who expect to be ruled by a king fall instead under a savage tyranny, and too many rulers mask the injustice of their rule with the cloak of regal dignity. There are many examples of this to be found in the history of the Roman Republic. Their first kings were driven out by the Romans when they would no longer support the burden of their rule, or rather of the tyranny. Then they set up for themselves consuls and other magistrates to rule and guide them, wishing thus to change from a monarchy to an aristocracy. Sallust refers to this, saying, "It is almost incredible, if we call to mind how speedily the Roman state grew, when once it had achieved its liberty. For it often happens that men who are ruled by a monarch are slow to interest themselves in the common welfare, since they are of opinion that whatever they do for the common good will in no way benefit themselves, but only serve to enrich whoever appears to control the public interest. But if there is no one person with power over the common interest, they go about the corporate task as though it were their own business, and not merely profitable to another. So experience has shown that a single city, with an administration which is changed annually, can sometimes accomplish more than 3 or 4 cities under a monarchy. And small services exacted by a king bear more heavily than much greater burdens imposed by the community of citizens. The Roman Republic provides a very good example of this point, for under it the people were conscripted to military service, and payment was made for such service. But when the public funds were insufficient to meet this debt, private wealth was taxed to such an extent that not even the senators retained any gold, except for a ring and a seal, which were the sign of office. But later, being weakened by continual dissensions which developed into civil wars, they lost that liberty for which they had striven so hard, and fell under the government of the emperors, who would not at first accept the title of king, since the very name king was still odious to the Romans. Certain of these emperors, after the fashion of good kings, faithfully served the common interest, and by their efforts the Roman state grew in strength and power. The majority of them, however, were tyrants to their subjects and weak and impotent before their enemies, so that under them the Roman state fell away to naught. The same story can also be seen in the case of the Jews. When at first they were ruled by judges, they were devastated by their enemies, for each man was in the habit of attending only to his own business. Then, in answer to their prayers, God gave them kings. But in consequence of their sinfulness of the kings, they fell away from the worship of the true God and were finally reduced to captivity. From one side and from another, therefore, there is danger. Whether from fear of tyranny the best benefits of monarchy are lost, or whether in the hope of achieving true kingship the government degenerates into evil tyranny. Chapter 5. Monarchy, the best defence against tyranny. When a choice has to be made between two courses of action, both of which are fraught with danger, one should choose that which will lead to the lesser evil. Monarchy, however, if it degenerates into tyranny, is accompanied by less evil consequences than when the government of many becomes corrupt. For the dissensions which commonly follow government by many are destructive to the benefits of peace, which is the most important thing for any social life. But this benefit is not altogether destroyed by a tyranny, since under tyranny it is individual satisfaction which is most affected, unless of course the tyranny be so unbounded as to enslave the entire community. So government by one is to be preferred to government by many, though each has its own dangers. Furthermore, that course of action should rather be avoided from which danger can more frequently arise. But the greatest dangers to a community more often arise under a pluralistic government than under government by one person. For a man may more often be deflected from the common interest if he be one of many than if he be alone in government. And whenever one out of a number who form the government fails in his duty to the common welfare, he puts the whole community in danger of strife, for disagreement among rulers is followed by general dissension. If, on the other hand, there is one person alone at the head of the government, he will more often attend to the common interest, and even if he fails in such high intention, it does not necessarily follow that he will oppress the whole community and become straightway an absolute tyrant, which, as we have seen, is the worst form of government. So, the dangers which arise out of the government by many are more to be avoided than those consequent upon monarchy. Again, the degeneration of government into tyranny is no less frequent under a pluralistic than under a monarchical form of government. In fact, it is probably more frequent. For when dissension breaks out under a pluralistic form of government, one man will often take the lead among the others, and usurp to himself power over the whole community, as is clearly seen from what has happened in history. Nearly every pluralistic regime has ended in tyranny, as the history of the Roman state abundantly shows. For when it had long been administered by magistrates, there began plots and dissensions and even civil wars, and the republic fell into the hands of the most cruel tyrants. As a general rule, in fact, when one considers the events both of history and of our own times, it is clear that tyranny has more frequently flourished in those lands which had a pluralistic government than in those which were governed by monarchs. Thus, if monarchy, which is the best form of government, is to be avoided mainly because of the danger of tyranny, and if tyranny comes about not less but rather more frequently under a pluralistic regime, we are left with the simple conclusion that it is more expedient to live under a monarchy than under a pluralistic government. Chapter 6. The excellence of monarchy and the safeguards necessary to prevent its degenerating into tyranny. Since government by one person, being the best, is to be preferred, and since, as we have shown, there is always a danger that it will develop into tyranny, which is the worst government, every precaution must be taken to provide the community with a ruler who will not become a tyrant. In the first place, it is necessary that whoever of the possible candidates is proclaimed king shall be of such character that it is unlikely that he will become a tyrant. So Samuel, praising God's providence in instituting kingship, says in Kings, "The Lord hath sought out for himself a man after his own heart." Next, a monarchy should be so constituted that there is no opportunity for the king, once he is reigning, to become a tyrant. And at the same time, the kingly power should be so restricted that he could not easily turn to tyranny. The steps to be taken to this end will be considered later. Finally, we must consider the action to be taken should a king become tyrannical. If the tyranny be not excessive, it is certainly wiser to tolerate it in limited measure, at least for a time, rather than to run the risk of even greater perils by opposing it. For those who take action against a tyrant may fail in their subject, and only succeed in rousing the tyrant to greater savagery. Even when action against a tyrant meets with success, this very fact breeds strife and grave discord among the populace, either in the moment of rebellion or after his overthrow, when opinion in the community is factiously divided as to the new form of government. Again, a community sometimes succeeds in deposing a tyrant with the help of some other ruler, who in turn seizes absolute power. But fear of sharing the fate of his predecessor drives him to even greater severity against his new subjects. Thus it is often the case with tyranny that a new tyrant is worse than the old, for the newcomer abandons none of his predecessor's cruelties, but plans even greater oppression in the evil of his heart. So, at the time when the Syracusans all desired the death of Dionysus, there was an old woman who continually prayed that he would survive her. The tyrant, coming to know of this, asked why she acted thus, and she replied, "When I was yet a girl, we were oppressed by a tyrant, and I desired his death. But when he was slain, but was succeeded by another who oppressed us even more harshly, and again I was greatly pleased to see the end of his reign. But he was succeeded by you, who are an even harsher ruler. So I fear that if you are taken from our midst, you will be succeeded by one who is even more terrible." If, however, tyranny becomes so excessive as to be intolerable, it has been argued that it would be an act of virtue for the more powerful citizens to kill the tyrant, even exposing themselves to the peril of death for the liberation of the community. There is an example of this situation in the Old Testament. A certain Aoth slew Eglon, king of the Moabites, with a dagger thrust in his side, because he oppressed the people of God with dire bondage, and for this he was made a judge of the people. But this does not agree with apostolic teaching, for Peter teaches us to obey not only good and temperate rulers, but also to bear reverence to those who are ill-disposed. It is the patience of the innocent sufferer that wins credit in God's sight. Thus, during the persecutions of many Roman emperors against the faith of Christ, a great part of the people, both nobles and commoners, were converted to the faith and made no resistance, but suffered death for Christ with great courage and resignation, as is clear from the example of the Holy Legion of Thebes. As to the case of Aoth, it would appear that he slew an enemy rather than a legitimate, although tyrannical, ruler of the people. So, again in the Old Testament, we read that those who slew Joas, king of Judah, were put to death, even though he was an apostate, and that their children were spared according to the precept of the law. It would indeed be dangerous, both for the community and for its rulers, if individuals were, upon private initiative, to attempt the death of those who govern, albeit tyrannically. it is in fact more common for evildoers than for just men to expose themselves to such dangers, because the rule of a just king is no less burdensome to the evil than that of a tyrant. For as Solomon says in Proverbs, the wise king scatters the impious. The consequence of such presumption is more likely to be the loss of a good king to the community than any benefit from the suppression of tyranny. It seems, then, that the remedy against the evils of tyranny lies rather in the hands of the public authority than in the private judgment of individuals. In particular, where a community has the right to elect a ruler for itself, it would not be contrary to justice for that community to depose the king whom it has elected, nor to curb his power should he abuse it to play the tyrant. Nor should the community be accused of disloyalty for thus deposing a tyrant, even after a previous promise of constant fealty. For the tyrant lays himself open to such treatment by his failure to discharge the duties of his office as governor of the community, and in consequence his subjects are no longer bound by their oath to him. So the Romans deposed Tarquinius the Proud, whom they had previously accepted as king, because of his and his children's tyranny, and substituted the lesser or consular power instead. So also Domitian, succeeding those mildest of emperors, Vespasian, his father, and Titus his brother, was slain by the Roman Senate because of his tyranny, and all the injustices which he had brought upon the Romans were legally and wisely revoked and made void by decree of the Senate. It was thus that St. John, the beloved disciple of God, who was banished into exile on the island of Patmos by Domitian, was by decree of the Senate brought back to Ephesus. If, on the other hand, the right to appoint a king over a certain community belongs to some superior, then the remedy against tyrannical excess must be sought from him. Thus the Jews made complaint to Caesar Augustus that Archelaus, when the latter began to rule in the place of his father Herod in Judea and had begun to imitate his father's evil ways. At first, therefore, his power was curtailed, the title of king being taken from him, and the half of his kingdom being divided between the two brothers. Then, when this proved insufficient to restrain his tyranny, he was exiled by Tiberius Caesar to Lyon, a city in France. Finally, when there is no hope of human aid against tyranny, recourse must be made to God the King of all, and the helper of all who call upon him in the time of tribulation. For it is in his power to turn the cruel heart of a tyrant to gentleness. As Solomon declares in Proverbs, the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. Whithersoever he will, he shall turn it. He turned the cruelty of the king of Assyria to pity when he meditated death to the Jews. It was he who so converted the cruel king Nabuchodonosor that he openly confessed the divine power. Now, indeed, he said, I, Nabuchodonosor, I think it means Nebuchadnezzar, but this is a Latinate translation, so it's a little bit different. Do praise and magnify and glorify the King of heaven, because all his works are true, and his ways judgments. And them that walk in pride he is able to abase. Daniel 4. As for those tyrants whom he considers unworthy of conversion, he can take them from among us, or reduce them to impotency, as we are told by the wise men of Ecclesiastes. God hath overturned the thrones of proud princes, and hath set up the meek in their stead. Again, it is he who seeking the affliction of his people in Egypt, and hearing their cries, cast down the tyrant Pharaoh with his whole army into the sea. Not only did he depose the proud Nebuchadnezzar, already mentioned, but cast him out like a beast from the company of men. Nor is his arm now any less strong to liberate his people from the oppression of tyrants. He promised his people by Isaiah to give them peace from their labours, and from the confusion and dire servitude under which they once suffered. And by Ezekiel he said, I will deliver my flock from their mouth. That is, from those shepherds who feed only themselves. But for men who merit such benefit of God, they must abstain from sinning, because it is a punishment for sin that, by divine permission, the impious are allowed to rule. As the Lord himself warns us by Hosea, I will give thee a king in my wrath. And again in Job, it is said, He maketh a man who is a hypocrite to rule because of the sins of his people. So guilt must first be expiated before the affliction of tyranny may cease. Chapter 7. Whether honour or glory are sufficient incentives for a monarch to govern wisely. Since, as we have already shown, it is the duty of a king to provide for the good of the community, and since such a task would appear to be too heavy unless it were accompanied by some commiserative reward, we must now consider what is the particular reward for a good monarch. Some have been of the opinion that it is nothing else than honour and glory. Thus Cicero says in De Republica, the ruler of a city should be flattered with honours. And the reason for this seems to be indicated by Aristotle in the Ethics, when he says, a prince who is not satisfied with his honour and glory becomes a tyrant. For there is within the soul of all an urge to seek their own satisfaction. So, if a prince were not satisfied with the honour and glory that was his, he would seek further riches and pleasures, and so would become rapacious and unjust towards his subjects. But if we accept such an opinion, many unfortunate consequences follow. In the first place, it would be altogether too burdensome for a king to undertake so great a risk, and to be harried by so many cares, for so fragile a reward. For in the whole range of human affairs, nothing would seem to be more uncertain than the glory and honour of popular favour, since it depends upon human opinion, which is the most changeable of things on earth. For this reason Isaias the prophet likens such glory to grass of the field. Furthermore, the desire of human glory destroys magnanimity of the soul. For whosoever seeks favour of men must consider their desires in all that he says and does. Thus, because of his desire to please men, he becomes the servant of individuals. For this reason, the same Cicero, in his De Officiis, warns us to be aware of the desire of glory. It is this, in fact, which destroys that liberty of spirit which should be the greatest aspiration of the magnanimous man, while there is nothing that befits a prince who is elected to act with righteousness than this same magnanimity of soul. We must conclude, then, that human glory is an insufficient reward for the kingly office. Not only is this the case, but it is also hurtful to the community to set such a reward before princes, for it is the duty of a just man to despise glory, together with all other temporal rewards. A virtuous and high-souled man should despise glory and even life itself for the sake of justice. So it is a remarkable paradox that while glory follows virtuous action, there is virtue in despising glory. Thus, by holding glory in contempt, a man becomes the more renowned. As Fabius once said, he shall find true glory who spurns it. And Sallust said of Cato, the less he sought after fame, the more renowned did he become. And the disciples of Christ showed themselves to be ministers of God both in glory and in shame, through good report and evil report. A good man, then, is not fittingly rewarded merely by that glory which the good avoid. And if this were the sole reward for ruling, it would follow that good men would never accept such an office, or, accepting it, they would have to go unrewarded. Furthermore, the love of glory leads to other and more dangerous evils. Many have been led to seek, too, great renown by making war, and, perishing with their whole army, have left the independence of their country at the mercy of an alien power. For this reason, Torquatus, king of the Romans, wishing to show how necessary it is to avoid such danger, slew his own son for allowing himself to be stung to act against others by the gibes of the enemy, even though he did in his youthful zeal kill his adversary. So much did he fear the evil which might follow such an example of presumption, compared with the advantage gained from the death of an enemy. There is another vice which is of like nature with the desire of glory, and that is deceit. For it is a difficult task, and one in which few succeed, to practice true virtue, which alone is honourable. But because many desire glory, they are led to simulate virtue. So, as Sallust says, ambition has made many false, having one sentiment in their hearts and another ready to their tongue. They are all appearance and no substance. And our Saviour himself calls them hypocrites and dissimulators who do good, only that they may be seen by men. So, just as it is perilous for the community if the ruler should seek pleasures and riches for his reward, and thus become rapacious and overbearing, it is equally perilous if he be eaten up by the desire of glory, and thus become presumptuous and a deceiver. The intention, then, of the wise writers whom we first quoted was not to set the love of honour and glory as the true object of a good ruler, and the main reward for good government, but rather to show that it is more tolerable for a ruler to seek glory than to be given over to the desire of riches or of pleasures. For, though a vice, it is a little nearer to virtue, since the glory which men seek, as Augustine tells us, is no more than the judgment of those who think well of their fellows. So the desire of glory bears some traces of virtue, for it does at least seek the approval of the good and avoids giving them displeasure. And when so few attain true virtue, it would seem more tolerable to choose for the kingly office one who at least fears the judgment of men and is, to that extent, prevented from open evil-doing. In fact, a man who desires glory is either driven along the true path of virtuous action to win the approval of men, or at least he tries for such approval by trickery and fraud. But one who desires only to dominate and cares nothing for glory will not fear the disapproval of right-thinking men, but will more often seek to obtain what he wants by open crimes, surpassing even the beasts in cruelty and debauchery. So Augustine says of Nero that he was too vicious for any manly action to be expected of him, and so cruel that not a trace of kindliness was left in his character. Aristotle's description of the magnanimous man in the Ethics puts the matter very clearly. Such a one does not seek honour and glory, as though they were complete and sufficient reward for virtue. Yet he is content to receive nothing more from men. For of all earthly rewards, the highest, perhaps, is that a man's virtue should be publicly attested by his fellows.